Cam Newton didn't just criticize the Atlanta Falcons, he detonated the conversation. One viral clip, one explosive reaction, and suddenly the Falcons' newest coaching hire turned into one of the most controversial moves of the entire offseason. Because according to Cam, this isn't just about football anymore. This is about culture. This is about community. And this is about what message Atlanta just sent to the rest of the league. Here, what made this moment hit so hard? The Falcons didn't quietly hire a random coordinator. They brought in Kevin Stefanski, a coach whose name is still tied to the Shedeur Sanders situation in Cleveland. And the timing couldn't be worse. Atlanta sits in the NFC South, one of the most culturally influential divisions in football, in a city that lives and breathes Black sports culture. So when Cam Newton stepped in and called the move tone-deaf and disrespectful, people didn't just listen, they leaned in. Cam didn't hold back. He questioned how a coach accused by critics of mishandling young Black quarterbacks could suddenly be placed at the center of one of the most culturally powerful football markets in America. And that's where this story stops being about X's and O's. Because now it's about optics, it's about trust, and it's about whether ownership actually understands the city they represent. Fans didn't wait long to react. Social media lit up. Comment sections turned into war zones. Some Falcons supporters started calling for boycotts before Stefanski even stepped on the field. Others said this felt like history repeating itself. Another front office move made without listening to the fan base. And the craziest part, this backlash didn't come from trolls. It came from former players, community voices, and fans who normally support the team through anything. That's how you know this hit a nerve. Because Atlanta isn't just another NFL market. It's a cultural hub, a city where identity matters, a place where football is connected to legacy, community, and pride. And Cam Newton made one thing clear: when you ignore that reality, you don't just lose games, you lose the locker room before the season even starts. But that wasn't even the most explosive part of what Cam said. Because once he brought up Shedeur Sanders, things escalated fast, and that's where this controversy really started to spiral. Cam Newton didn't wait for press conferences. He didn't wait for preseason games. The moment the Falcons announced Kevin Stefanski, Cam went straight for the heart of the issue. His main question was simple but brutal. How does a coach with Stefanski's recent history end up leading one of the most culturally powerful franchises in the league? Cam pointed directly to the Shedeur Sanders situation in Cleveland. According to Cam, what happened there wasn't just poor coaching. He framed it as a pattern of mismanagement that hit young Black quarterbacks the hardest. And that's why this hire didn't sit right with him. In his words, Stefanski didn't give Shedeur a fair opportunity. Limited reps, poor protection, no real development plan. And when things went wrong, the blame landed on the player instead of the system. That's the part Cam says fans should be paying attention to. Because if it happened once, what's stopping it from happening again? Cam also pointed out the optics. Stefanski is leaving a locker room where culture was already shaky and walking into Atlanta, where culture isn't optional, it's everything. This is Cleveland. This isn't a low-noise market. Every move gets magnified. Every mistake gets amplified. And that's why Cam believes this hire wasn't just risky, it was reckless. But the criticism didn't stop with Shedeur Sanders. Because once Cam started breaking down Stefanski's actual track record, the numbers told an even uglier story, and that's where things got uncomfortable. This is where Cam Newton's anger really came from. Because to him, the Shedeur Sanders situation wasn't just a bad coaching decision, it was a warning sign. When Shedeur arrived in Cleveland, expectations were high. Young quarterback, big spotlight, massive pressure. The kind of moment that can either launch a career or quietly derail it. And according to Cam, Stefanski handled it the worst way possible. Instead of building around Shedeur's strengths, reports and insiders claim the system stayed rigid. Limited flexibility, inconsistent reps, and protection that collapsed week after week. Shadyer was constantly under pressure, forced into survival mode instead of development mode. That's not how you grow a young quarterback. That's how you break one. Cam made it clear, development isn't just about playbooks. It's about trust. It's about giving a young player room to make mistakes without pulling the rug out from under them. And in Cleveland, that foundation never existed. What made it even worse was how the narrative flipped afterward. When things didn't work, fingers pointed at Shadyer instead of the system. Instead of accountability at the coaching level, the blame shifted downward. Cam called that out immediately. Because he's lived it. Cam knows exactly what it feels like when organizations quietly give up on quarterbacks instead of actually building them up. And that's why he wasn't buying the excuses. In his mind, Shadyer wasn't set up to fail by accident. He was placed in an environment that never prioritized his growth from day one. And now here's the part that made fans uneasy. Atlanta is walking into the same setup. Young quarterback, massive expectations, cultural spotlight, high-pressure market, and now the same coach who struggled to handle it before is being handed another opportunity to shape the future. That's why Cam isn't just criticizing the past. He's warning about what could happen next. Because if Atlanta doesn't learn from Cleveland's mistakes, history might be getting ready to repeat itself. Here, where Cam Newton stopped talking about opinions and started talking about receipts. Because this isn't just about Shadyer. It's about a pattern. During Kevin Stefanski's time in Cleveland, the Browns cycled through 13 different quarterbacks. 13. That's not bad luck. That's organizational chaos. And according to Cam, that number alone exposes the real issue. When one quarterback struggles, you adjust. When 5 struggle, you reassess. But when 13 different players come through the same system and none of them develop into long-term solutions, the problem isn't the talent anymore. The problem is the environment. Cam pointed out that every quarterback who entered Cleveland under Stefanski arrived with promise and left with questions. Confidence dipped, production stalled, progress plateaued. Instead of building continuity, the Browns kept resetting the position over and over again. And here's the scary part for Atlanta. The Falcons don't have the luxury of experimenting. They've invested in young offensive weapons. They've committed to a quarterback future. They're trying to build stability. And now they're handing that responsibility to a coach whose recent history shows instability at the most important position in football. Cam didn't sugarcoat it. He basically asked, if you couldn't develop one quarterback in Cleveland, why should Atlanta expect a different outcome? That question is now echoing across Falcons fans, social media, and locker room conversations. Because once a coach gets labeled as someone who can't grow quarterbacks, that reputation sticks. And if Atlanta ignores that warning, they might be walking straight into the same cycle Cleveland couldn't escape. Now here, where the situation gets even more uncomfortable. Because Atlanta isn't a rebuilding team full of placeholders. They're young, they're talented, and they're positioned for a breakout if the right leadership is in place. Cam Newton made this point crystal clear. Look at the roster. Michael Penix Jr. at quarterback, Drake London on the outside, Kyle Pitts at tight end, Bijan Robinson in the backfield. That's not a project roster, that's a foundation. And that's exactly why this hire feels risky. Stefanski isn't walking into a team that needs to be torn down. He's inheriting something that's already built to compete, which means his job isn't to experiment. His job is to elevate. But Cam's concern is simple. If Stefanski struggled to develop quarterbacks and young offensive talent in Cleveland, what makes anyone confident this situation will be different? Atlanta's roster is loaded with players who need structure, consistency, and trust from the coaching staff. They need a system that maximizes speed, creativity, and confidence, not one that creates hesitation and resets every season. And here's the part that really hit fans. Cam said Atlanta didn't just hire a coach. They hired a philosophy. A philosophy that hasn't proven it can grow young stars. A philosophy that's already burned one highly publicized quarterback situation. And a philosophy that now gets handed one of the youngest offensive cores in the NFC. That's not just a football gamble. That's a franchise-level bet. And what happens next could determine whether Atlanta finally turns the corner or repeats the same mistakes under a different name. And this is where Cam Newton stopped speaking emotionally and started speaking with receipts. Because once the stats entered the chat, the entire debate shifted. Cam pointed out something that stunned a lot of fans who hadn't looked closely at Stefanski's track record. Over his time in Cleveland, Stefanski cycled through 13 different quarterbacks. 13. And not one of them developed into a consistent, long-term franchise solution under his system. Let that sink in. That's not bad luck. That's not coincidence. That's a pattern. Cam's message was clear. When the same coach keeps getting different quarterbacks but the results stay the same, the problem isn't the players anymore. The problem becomes the environment, the system, and the leadership. He also highlighted the recent win-loss numbers. Atlanta fired their previous coach for underperforming, yet Stefanski's last 2 seasons in Cleveland were statistically worse. Fewer wins, worse offensive rankings, and constant instability at the most important position in football. So Cam asked the question everyone is thinking. How do you justify firing one coach for struggling, then replacing him with someone who struggled even more? And that's why this hire doesn't just feel confusing, it feels backwards. Atlanta fans aren't just upset because of culture concerns. They're upset because the football logic doesn't line up either. And when culture concerns collide with questionable performance history, that's when backlash explodes. But here's the part that really raised eyebrows. Cam didn't frame this as a one-off mistake. He framed it as Atlanta ignoring clear warning signs that could come back to haunt this franchise fast. And what happens next may decide whether this hire becomes a redemption story or one of the most criticized coaching decisions in recent Falcons history. Here, what makes this situation explode louder than a normal bad hire? Usually, fans complain about play calling, records, or draft picks. This time, it goes way deeper than that. Cam Newton made it clear that this isn't just about wins and losses. It's about identity, it's about trust, and it's about what Atlanta represents. Atlanta isn't just another NFL city. It's a cultural capital, a place where Black excellence, community pride, and legacy actually matter to the fan base. When you bring in a coach who's already being accused of mishandling young Black quarterbacks, that tension doesn't fade, it multiplies. That's why the reaction feels personal. Falcons fans aren't just questioning Stefanski's football IQ. They're questioning whether the front office understands the city they operate in, whether ownership truly respects the culture that fills that stadium every Sunday. And that's dangerous territory for any franchise. Because once fans stop trusting leadership, it doesn't matter how good your roster looks on paper. Every loss becomes louder. Every mistake becomes magnified. Every press conference becomes a battlefield. Cam warned that Stefanski won't be given the typical grace period most new coaches get. He's walking into instant pressure. One bad stretch, one young player mismanaged, one quarterback setback, and the noise will turn into full-blown chaos. And that's exactly why this next part matters most. Because the real question isn't what Cam Newton said. It's what the Falcons do next, and whether this situation explodes into a cultural standoff or quietly forces ownership to respond. Now the spotlight shifts to Atlanta. Cam Newton said what millions of fans were already thinking, But now the Falcons front office has to live with the consequences of this decision. Kevin Stefanski isn't walking into a clean slate. He's walking into scrutiny, cultural pressure, and a fan base that already feels disrespected. Every quarterback decision will be analyzed. Every offensive struggle will be magnified. And every comparison to what happened with Shedeur Sanders will resurface the moment things go wrong. This isn't just about football anymore. It's about trust, identity, and whether Atlanta's leadership actually understands the city they represent. If Stefanski succeeds, it becomes one of the biggest redemption stories in the league. But if he fails, this hire will be remembered as one of the most tone-deaf decisions in Falcons history. And one thing is clear: the patience clock is already ticking. Now it's your turn. Do you agree with Cam Newton? Or do you think Atlanta deserves to see this play out on the field? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep breakdowns, and stay locked in. This story is just getting started.